This powerful insight sets the tone for our journey. Today, we're delving into the thin line between sanity and psychopathy, guided by the compelling true story found in Ronson's The Psychopath Test, a journey through the madness industry. In this reflective exploration, we'll see how understanding our own inner darkness might be the key to understanding the so-called madness in others. Ronson's journey introduces us to psychopaths, psychiatrists, and the madness industry itself. And through it, we'll confront deep questions about what it really means to be sane in an often crazy world. Ronson's book is part investigative journalism, part personal journey. It's an adventure that blurs the boundaries between the rational and the irrational. As we follow his encounters, from high-security asylums to corporate boardrooms, we explore a central theme: that the line separating ordinary people from those we label psychopaths is thinner than we think. And perhaps by examining that line, we can learn something about ourselves, about empathy, self-awareness, and finding meaning even in life's darkest corners. How do we truly know who's sane or insane? This haunting question lies at the heart of Ronson's quest. Imagine meeting a charming CEO who fires thousands of employees without a hint of remorse, or a psychiatric patient who insists he's perfectly sane while doctors insist he's mad. Are we confident we could tell which one is the psychopath? In the Psychopath test, Ronson exposes just how blurred these distinctions can be. The book's central purpose is to examine the concept of madness in our society. Who gets labeled insane, who does the labeling, and what those labels mean. Ronson hooks us with a real-life mystery. Strange encrypted books mailed anonymously to academics. An enigma that first draws him into the world of the mentally extraordinary. From there, he meets people like Tony, a young man locked away in Broadmoor Hospital for the criminally insane because he pretended to be crazy, and now can't convince anyone he's actually sane. Through such stories, Ronson forces us to ask, where is the line between eccentricity and illness, between an ordinary lack of empathy and true psychopathy? The hook is clear. The more we look for madness in others, the more we question our own minds. To understand that thin line, we first need to know what psychopathy actually means. Psychologist Robert D. Hare devised a checklist that has become famous as the Psychopath test. The Hare Psychopathy Checklist Revised, PCLR, is a 20-item assessment of personality traits and behaviors used to identify psychopaths. It's essentially a list of common psychopathic traits. For example, glib superficial charm, an inflated sense of self-worth, constant lying and manipulation, a shocking lack of remorse or empathy, shallow emotions, and a tendency toward impulsive or irresponsible behavior. Each trait is scored, and a high total score suggests the person might be a psychopath. What does someone with a high score look like in real life? Ronson gives us a vivid example. He travels to meet Al Chainsaw Dunlap, a former Sunbeam CEO known for ruthlessly slashing thousands of jobs without blinking. At Dunlap's palatial home in Florida, Ronson can't help but notice the decor. Statues of sharks and predators adorning the estate, a not-so-subtle reflection of Dunlap's predatory business philosophy. As they talk, Ronson quietly ticks off items from Hare's checklist in his mind. Dunlap is charming and confident, but also displays a chilling lack of remorse for the lives upended by his corporate conquests. Firing people didn't bother him. In fact, he claims it made companies leaner. He speaks of business as war, the superficial charm, the grandiose ego, the callous lack of empathy. Trait by trait, the CEO seems to embody the very definition of a psychopath living among us. Yet Dunlap is not behind bars or in a hospital. He's a successful, if notorious, businessman. This example illustrates the core of psychopathy. It's not just serial killers and movie villains. Psychopathic traits often hide in plain sight, sometimes behind friendly faces and successful careers. The Hare checklist gives us a framework to identify these traits, bringing a kind of clarity, but also a power that can be unsettling. After all, once you have a psychopath test, you might start seeing psychopaths everywhere. Ronson actually experienced this. After learning the checklist, he began spotting psychopathic traits in people all around him, which both excited and alarmed him. We'll soon see why that's a double-edged sword. With the psychopath test in hand, it's tempting to start labeling people left and right. Ronson himself admits that suddenly, madness was everywhere in his view. But here, we confront a major theme: society's obsession with slapping diagnoses on people and the risks that come with it. Are we too eager to call someone insane or evil? What harm can it do when we reduce a complicated person to a label like psychopath? To answer this, let's consider Carl Jung's concept of the shadow. Jung believed each of us has a hidden, darker side of our personality, unconscious traits and impulses we reject in ourselves. Often, instead of facing our own darkness, we project it onto others. In Jung's words, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. We might call someone else a monster or a psychopath, partly because we're unwilling to acknowledge our own capacity for cruelty, anger, or selfishness. By labeling them as the crazy one, we feel safer about ourselves. This is projection. If we repress our shadow, it eventually manifests through projection, where we place our repressed qualities onto others, as one explanation of Jung's theory puts it. Ronson's journey provides a cautionary tale about this impulse to label. Remember Tony, the young man in Broadmoor Hospital? He feigned insanity as a teenager to avoid a prison sentence, thinking hospital would be an easier ride. But that plan backfired horribly. Doctors labeled Tony a psychopath, a dangerous and severe personality disorder. Once that label stuck, nothing he did could convince them otherwise. If he acted calm and normal, they said it was a sign of his psychopath cunning, charming them to manipulate results. If he got upset, it just confirmed his instability. Tony himself lamented, "Trying to prove you're not a psychopath is even harder than trying to prove you're not mentally ill." His story illustrates how a label can become a trap, a prism through which every action is twisted to fit the diagnosis. Only after many years and the intervention of skeptical new clinicians was Tony deemed sane enough to be released, despite his file still bristling with psychopath checklist scores. Our society, as Ronson observes, loves neat categories: sane, insane, normal, abnormal. We see it in media too, the way journalists highlight the most extreme madness in a person's story to create sensational headlines. But reality isn't so simple. Quick labels can dehumanize. As Ronson dryly notes, we are defining the boundaries of normality by tearing apart the people outside it. In other words, we often decide who's normal by vilifying those we consider not normal. This oversimplification is dangerous. It blinds us to the humanity of the person behind the label and to the nuances of mental health. It can even become a self-fulfilling prophecy, as with Tony's case. Jung's insight encourages us instead to turn inward. Know your own darkness. If we understand our shadow, we are less likely to project it outward. We become more cautious about calling someone else purely insane or evil, recognizing that people are complicated mixtures of light and dark, just like us. The line between sanity and madness is thin, partly because it runs through each of us. Society's obsession with labeling others as psychopaths might just be a way of whistling in the dark. reassuring ourselves that the bad ones are over there, separate from us. But as Jung and Ronson both suggest, acknowledging our shared capacity for darkness can make us more compassionate and wise in judging others. How then should we judge or respond to the madness we see in the world? Here, some ancient wisdom from Stoic philosophy offers guidance. The Stoic teacher Epictetus famously taught, "It is not events that disturb people, it is their judgments concerning them." In other words, what upsets us isn't what happens out there, but how we interpret what happens. This idea resonates profoundly in the context of psychopathy and sanity. The behaviors we label as crazy or psychopathic, are they inherently so, or do they disturb us because of how we judge them? Consider again Tony's situation. The event is that he sits calmly in a hospital lounge, behaving normally. One judgment, he's sane and should be released. Another judgment from the doctors. His normal demeanor is an act, a symptom of a psychopath's manipulative nature. The same facts, different interpretations, and Tony's fate swings in the balance of those judgments. This echoes Epictetus. It was the doctor's judgment that kept Tony locked up, more than Tony's actual behavior. On a larger scale, when we hear about a heinous crime, Stoicism reminds us that calling the perpetrator a madman is a judgment we overlay on the facts. That judgment might be useful to society, or it might be an oversimplification, but recognizing it as a judgment is important. It opens a space for understanding rather than knee-jerk fear. The Stoics advised cultivating calm and reason in the face of life's storms. Seneca, another Stoic, wrote, "We are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more from imagination than from reality." How much of our fear of insane people is actually our imagination running wild? Sometimes the label psychopath conjures up images of inhuman monsters, when in reality we might be dealing with a troubled individual who could use help, or just a ruthless but rational person who isn't actually hallucinating or mad in the clinical sense. Stoicism urges us to pause and question. Are we reacting to actual events, or to the story our mind is telling us about those events? By adopting a Stoic lens, we can approach mental health and morality with more nuance. For instance, instead of immediately condemning someone as irredeemably insane or evil, we try to understand the causes and beliefs behind their actions, what the Stoics might call examining our impressions and asking if they are true. This doesn't mean excusing harmful behavior. The Stoics were also keen on personal responsibility. But it means not allowing our judgments or anger to cloud our understanding. It's not events, but our judgments, Epictetus reminds us, and even modern psychology agrees. Cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, is built on this Stoic insight that how we think about events shapes our emotions more than the events themselves. So how does Stoicism help us with the thin line of sanity? It teaches us equanimity, to remain level-headed when confronting someone's odd or alarming behavior, and to respond with wisdom rather than panic or scorn. It also teaches empathy in a way. By recognizing that anyone can fall into misjudgment or destructive behavior under certain impressions, we become less quick to label and more inclined to understand. A Stoic approach might lead us to ask, what's in my control here? Perhaps I can't control that there are psychopaths or that someone is acting irrationally, but I can control how I treat them and how I manage my own thoughts about it. This sets the stage for the next chapter, understanding that the boundary between sane and insane is not a chasm, but a spectrum we all navigate, and that by staying thoughtful and self-controlled, we can walk that line more wisely. Throughout the psychopath test, Ronson comes to a startling realization. Psychopathic traits exist on a continuum, and many of us exhibit them to some degree. This is the thin line we've been talking about. The idea that there isn't a hard divide between psychopaths and normal people, but rather a sliding scale. In fact, one psychiatrist tells Ronson that psychopaths aren't a completely separate species, as if carved out from humanity, but are part of the spectrum of human personality. This begs the question Ronson himself asks. Could it be that what separates an inmate at Broadmoor Hospital from a titan on Wall Street is often just a matter of degree, or even just luck and circumstance? Ronson muses, "I wondered if sometimes the difference between a psychopath in Broadmoor and a psychopath on Wall Street was the luck of being born into a stable, rich family. In other words, a clever, fearless boy from a wealthy background might become a powerful CEO, where those psychopathic tendencies are assets in cutthroat business, whereas the same boy born into poverty might run afoul of the law and be deemed antisocial or insane. History and culture also show a fine line between madness and genius. As the old saying, attributed to Aristotle, goes, there is no great genius without a touch of madness. Many artists, inventors, and leaders have had eccentric or extreme personalities. Some of the very traits on Hare's checklist, like bold risk-taking, grandiosity, or emotional detachment, can, in a different light, contribute to success. This doesn't mean all high achievers are psychopaths, of course, but it reminds us how context matters. Certain environments reward traits that in other contexts would be viewed as dysfunctional. The line is thin and often subjective. Ronson's interviews reinforce that everyday people can have bursts of psychopathic behavior too. Think about times you've acted with empathy off. Maybe during a heated argument you said something cruel without feeling immediate remorse, or you cut corners and rationalized it. These moments don't make you a psychopath, but they are reminders that the potential for callousness or deceit lives in all of us. Psychopathy might be an extreme, where these traits are frequent and intense, but it's built on tendencies that are human. Acknowledging this can actually make us more empathetic. If we admit, I too have a shadow, I too could be selfish or ruthless under certain conditions, then we approach those who live at the extremes with a bit more understanding, though still with necessary caution. So, could acknowledging our own darker traits lead to better empathy and understanding of others? Absolutely. When we recognize our inner darkness, we become less prone to demonize others for theirs. It fosters humility. There, but for the grace of circumstance, go I. John Ronson, by the end of his journey, seems less sure of where the line is drawn. He realized that labeling someone as a psychopath can be dangerously easy, and that in doing so, we might ignore context or the possibility of change. Interestingly, he shares a reassuring insight from psychologist Martha Stout. If learning about these traits makes you worry, do I have some of these signs? Could I be a psychopath? That very concern is a good sign you're not one. True psychopaths lack the self-doubt and empathy that would cause such worry. In other words, the very act of self-reflection, examining your own potential for madness, is what pulls you toward sanity. We only cross the thin line when we lose that self-awareness and empathy entirely. Recognizing our shared humanity doesn't mean we excuse harmful behavior. It means we approach it with a mindset geared toward understanding and, where possible, healing. If someone you know shows a lack of empathy or other dark traits, acknowledging that we all have a shadow lets you respond not with panic or hatred, but with cautious empathy and clear boundaries. The thin line is walked best with eyes open, both outward at others and inward at ourselves. At this point, you might wonder, What can we do with these insights? How do we apply them to lead better, more fulfilling lives? This is where an empowering lesson emerges. Viktor Frankl, a neurologist and psychiatrist who survived the horrors of a concentration camp, gave us a profound tool for personal growth. He said, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. This means that no matter what happens to us, the stimulus, we have a moment of decision on how to react. And in that moment lies our freedom to become who we want to be." How does this relate to psychopathy and understanding darkness? Well, when we encounter someone's darkness, say an unfair boss, a friend who betrays us, or even just reading about the manipulations of a psychopath, there's an initial stimulus. Perhaps we feel anger, fear, or judgment flare up. But between that trigger and what we do next, there is a space. We can pause in that space to reflect and choose. We can choose empathy over fury, or understanding over snap judgment. We can decide to set healthy boundaries with a toxic person instead of seeking revenge, for example. In that choice lies our growth. We transform a knee-jerk reaction into a mindful response. Frankl's teaching is empowering because it reminds us that even in the face of life's darkest situations, we retain the freedom to choose our attitude. Ronson's journey, for all its talk of madness and psychopaths, ultimately echoes this. Awareness is power. By becoming aware of the hidden patterns in others and ourselves, we can respond more wisely. Instead of just labeling someone and casting them out, maybe we engage that space. We gather more information. We reflect on what response will be constructive. Instead of freaking out that the world is full of psychopaths, we focus on what we can control, our own actions and character. Modern psychology backs this up. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, known for his work on the flow state, noted that happiness and meaning come largely from how we shape our inner experience, not from external events. Happiness, in fact, is a condition that must be prepared for, cultivated, and defended privately by each person. People who learn to control inner experience will be able to determine the quality of their lives, he wrote. In essence, we can't always control whether we meet a psychopath or face chaos, but we can control our inner response by practicing mindfulness, empathy, and purposeful action. This is strikingly similar to Stoic wisdom and Frankl's message. So take heart in the fact that increasing your awareness of your own emotions, of your shadow, of the humanity and fallibility of others is deeply empowering. It leads to better relationships because you're responding thoughtfully rather than with blind emotion. It leads to greater emotional intelligence. You become attuned to why someone might act insane or cruel, and you handle it in a way that doesn't add fuel to the fire. Perhaps you even help them by responding calmly or by not labeling them in a dismissive way. For example, if a coworker is remarkably cold and you suspect psychopathic traits, you can use that space to choose a wise response. Maintain professionalism, set limits, but also avoid unnecessary personal conflict. Or on a more everyday level, when a loved one does something hurtful, instead of immediately calling them crazy or reacting in anger, you pause. You consider what pain or confusion might have led to their action. You talk it out, or you walk away until you can respond calmly. In that choice, you grow, and often the relationship heals stronger. Viktor Frankl's life taught him that human beings can find meaning even in suffering by how they choose to see their situation. In our context, we find meaning by choosing understanding over ignorance. We grow by looking into our own hearts when confronted with others' darkness. As Frankl said, in that space to choose our response lies our freedom. We are no longer puppets of fear or prejudice. We become authors of our reactions and, by extension, our lives. John Ronson's The Psychopath test leaves us with a resonant message. In trying to understand psychopaths, we end up understanding ourselves. Recognizing psychopathy and madness in the world helps us recognize the darkness within us, and that understanding can breed empathy instead of fear. The thin line between sanity and madness turns out not to be a divide between us and them. It runs through each of us and through society as a whole. When we shine a light on that line, we gain insight into human nature, our capacity for harm, but also our capacity for self-awareness, change, and goodness. In the end, knowledge truly is power. Knowing about the hair checklist and how labels work means we won't be so easily seduced by simplistic judgments. Knowing about Jung's shadow means we'll think twice before condemning someone as a monster, and we'll be a bit braver in facing our own flaws. Knowing the Stoic perspective means we won't let the chaos of mad events shatter our inner peace. And embracing Frankl's wisdom means we'll remember, no matter how dark things get, we have the freedom to choose our next step toward the light. As Carl Jung wisely put it, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. In facing the darkness, both outside in society and inside ourselves, we move toward genuine enlightenment and understanding. So let's make our darkness conscious. Let's continue this journey of introspection and empathy. Take a moment to reflect on your own experiences. Have you ever questioned the line between sanity and madness in your life? Have you encountered someone who made you reconsider what normal really is? How did you respond, and what did you learn about yourself in that process? I invite you to share your thoughts or stories in the comments. Let's start a conversation about sanity, empathy, and self-awareness. By sharing and reflecting, we not only support each other's growth, but also inch closer to that enlightenment Jung spoke of, dealing with darkness by knowing our own. Together, by understanding the psychopath test and the human truths it unveils, we can foster a more compassionate and meaningful life. After all, when we look inside and truly know ourselves, we are far better equipped to deal with the world outside. And that knowledge of self and others is not just power, but freedom.